From Lansing Community College, this is LCC Connect, and this is Lanstories, with me, David Siwik. Each episode explores a different topic, such as the people, business, neighborhoods, communities, buildings, and other phenomena that make up the history of our college and our region. We tell stories, and in doing so, we connect the past to the present.
On this episode of Lanstories, I am joined in the studio by Matt VanAcker.
Hey, how are you, David?
I'm doing very well, Matt. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm awesome. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for being here, Matt. I have wanted to talk to Matt for quite some time on this program about a variety of things, especially and including the primary purpose of having Matt on the show today, which is to talk about Lansing during the Civil War. And Matt has recently published a book called
Lansing and the Civil War.
And
how's that for a plug?
There you go. Can't get any more direct than that. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. So we're very glad to have all of you with us, listening to us on this program. And Matt, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and how you came to be an author of a book that discusses Lansing's role in the Civil War?
Oh, I'd be happy to. So I make my living actually for the state of Michigan as the director of the State Capitol Tour Education and Information Service. That's a mouthful. Part of our responsibility, though, is caring for artifacts from the Capitol, including an incredible collection of 240 battle flags that were carried by Michigan soldiers in the Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I. Mm-hmm. The flags were actually taken out of the Capitol when it was restored about 30 years ago, and we got a great partnership with our friends at the State Museum. Mm-hmm. They've provided an archival storage space. So technically the collection is over at the museum now, but our staff helps in the care and feeding, if you will, and the conservation and preservation of the battle flags, and I direct that project. So, to answer your question, how I got swindled into writing a book, I had done some research, through the years, and connected with a lot of men from Lansing who'd fought and had read, stories about them, and I thought, boy, that'd make kind of a really great book someday. And right around the time COVID hit, I got an email unsolicited from an editor at History Press and said, hey, I read some stuff you wrote on the battle flags, on the web, and would you consider writing more? And I thought, so never thought I'd write a book, never intended to write a book. Still kind of can't believe that I wrote a book, to be quite honest with you, but it was a wonderful project. A little nervous at the start, then excited, once I started pulling the information together. And I just realized nothing had really been written about Lansing in that time period. My first idea was, well, I'll go to local historians. Surely someone's written something about, this time period in Lansing. And each of those historians individually said, no, nothing's really been written about that time period. And, it'd be a good thing to write about. And found some articles, newspapers, things like that, just small things that had been written. So my goal is to kind of pull it all together in one source and hopefully do honor to the men and their families who fought in the war and the families who supported them back home here in Lansing.
Well, speaking personally, I think you absolutely did accomplish that goal of doing the men honor. And really reading through this book, one of the things that struck me is that idea of honor, but as well as the central position that you put in the book of the role that those flags that you mentioned here a couple moments ago played, not only in the life of one of the gentlemen who's featured quite prominently in the book, Charles Foster, but other people who were involved in it as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about those flags and also how those flags were, from the sounds of reading the introduction and the remainder of the book, they were partially an avenue into looking at this topic.
Yeah, they really were. They were kind of my entree, into writing about Lansing and the war, and particular one individual who you mentioned, Charles Foster, who ended up becoming a flag bearer during the war for the 3rd Michigan Infantry Regiment. And being a flag bearer was an incredible honor, but it was also pretty much a death sentence. Yeah. And the men recognized that. The focal point of combat during the Civil War was around what the men affectionately referred to as the colors, the flags. They were their entry into the battles. When the battle flags moved forward, the regiment would form on them. When the battle flags were ordered to retreat, the men would follow them. if the color bearer planted his staff in the ground, the men knew their job was to defend that flag and their regiment's position on the battlefield to the last man if necessary. And absolutely unbelievable, incredible acts of bravery took place around the colors. And one of those men was from Lansing. Charles was actually not supposed to be in the color guard, but going into one of the battles of the peninsula, the color bearer had given out and was unable to fulfill his duty. And Charles volunteered to carry the flag. And I don't want to give too much away.
Of course.
But it's a really incredible story. The Foster family has a storied history in Lansing. Charles' father, Theodore, originally, when they lived near Ann Arbor, was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, moved up to Lansing when the Reform School was started by the state legislature, and eventually became the superintendent of the Reform School. His oldest son, Charles, is one of the first students at MAC, and works in and around Lansing as a young man before he enlists. He's the first man from Lansing to enlist in the Union Army.
It's really something.
And it's just a really, really incredible story of service and sacrifice, not only of Charles, but of his entire family. His brother Seymour sees action too during the war. His sister, Fanny, becomes the president of the Young Ladies Loyal League of Lansing and raising funds and material to send to the boys in the field. So it's literally an all-family effort.
Yeah, and that all-family effort and the all-community effort is another theme that is very prominent throughout this book. And one of the things that's really striking, I think, when people start learning about the Civil War is when they learn how very different the formation of the regiments were, the entire mustering into service of units, everything from fielding the men to arming them to providing uniforms for them, all of this was done very, very differently back then than it is now.
Yeah, it really was. It was very much a local effort. An infantry regiment during the Civil War at full strength was 1,000 men on the books anyway, which was composed of 10 companies of 100 men. So the state was given a quota of how many men we needed to provide for the Union war effort, split up by the 6 congressional districts. So each district was expected to supply a certain number of regiments and men. So these companies that form the regiments form very locally. I mean, these men know each other. I mean, they're brothers, they're fathers, there's grandfathers fighting in the same companies. There's, excuse me, boys you went to school with, boys you fidgeted in Sunday school with, or went to church with, men that you were working with in the factories or the farms. So when they form, these men know each other, and the companies have this familial connection. And even if you weren't related to the men in the company, you knew them, you'd grown up with them. Yeah. And often it's said, how could these men go into a storm of death, literally, almost daily in some of the parts of the war, and keep facing the Confederates as they did and not turn and run? And I think the answer, and Shelby Foote, a very well-known Civil War author, addressed this. He said, you went because the man next to you went, and because more often than not, he was a boy you grew up with.
Sure.
And you were going to turn and run when your boyhood friends were facing the fight and were going into that storm of death. And then how were you going to come home and recognize that you'd been a coward and not fought bravely?
It's a social dynamic.
It really was.
Very powerful.
It really was.
And back then, one of the worst things a man could ever be accused of being was a coward.
That's definitely true.
That carried some weight. And it really is quite remarkable how important, though, that local, and that community, and that family tie was. The historian James McPherson argued in a book called For Cause and Comrades I guess it's been about 25 years ago, actually, since that book was published, so a few plus a few. But that was really the central thesis of that book. And in fact, a lot of the evidence that he used is similar to the evidence that you used in your book in looking at the correspondence that Civil War soldiers kept. And in fact, the correspondence of Frank Sivard
Yeah.
And publishing in the local newspaper, his letters that he wrote was really, that formed an important part of your narrative, didn't it?
It really did. I have to put a plug in for newspapers.com and the fine volunteers that scan these and make them available to the public. I started my research literally at my timing was horrible. I started at the start of COVID. That was when I was approached, and I signed the contract literally in the early part of 2020, not knowing if I'd have access to research institutions. So I thought, what's the best way to immerse myself in that time period? And how am I going to do that? How am I going to put myself back in Lansing in 1861? And boy, newspapers.com, to my good fortune, every edition of the Lansing State Republican was online at newspapers.com. And I started finding these letters that these boys were writing home. And Frank's letters, incredible. He very creatively entitled them "Stray Leaves from Camp."
I thought that was very clever.
He also numbered each of them. So I knew if I was missing one, I had to go back and look. Because, the State Republican was only a 4-page paper, 7 columns per page, and it was only published once a week. I read 7 years of them. That was my first. I spent a full year just reading all of the articles, the advertisements. But when I started finding the letters from the boys, and they were so descriptive, and they're writing about their camps of instruction here in Michigan. They're writing about being stationed in D.C. They're writing about the food and what they miss of home, and mostly the food and family. They're writing about their lack of pay, their lack of uniforms. Some things never change, in the military. And then when they start to see combat, they're writing descriptive letters to their families sometimes, which are then in turn turned over to the Republican, which are dutifully published word for word. And it's not just severed. It's a number of the boys from the other regiments and companies that are turning, these letters, they're, sending them home to their families.
Yeah.
Treasure trove of information.
Absolute treasure trove. And my mind as a historian is always going very fast when I read through sources such as this. And I imagine yours did as well, including the letters and all of the other elements that were in those old newspapers that you were reading through. And I probably would have done the exact same thing if I wanted to get my mind into the mind of somebody walking the streets of Lansing in the 1860s, because where else would you go?
It was the source for me. And I readily admit that had it not been for my access to the State Republican, the book would have been very different. It really it gave me a connection, a deep connection to the boys and to their families. I started doing the research as a historian, and I found I couldn't help myself. I became attached to these boys, and they would write about their families, and I could tell you what they were growing in their gardens before they enlisted, the names of their children, as they were published in the State Republican. And a really incredible thing happened. They became almost a part of my family in reading about these incredible people that did so much, for the war effort to end slavery and keep our union.
Absolutely. And that is another point that comes through very strong in your book. And in fact, the human element of discussing war is it's difficult, but it's absolutely essential. War involves people, and it involves people doing very bad things to one another, and there's usually a reason for it.
Yeah, it does. And, I've never been, even though I consider myself as an amateur Civil War historian, through my work with the flags, I never professed to be an expert Civil War historian. I know bits and pieces, as it pertains to the battle flags that the boys fought beneath and the regimental histories. But I've never been one to say, well, yeah, this regiment was part of so-and-so's brigade, which was part of so-and-so's division in this Army Corps. I could never keep straight all of those minute details.
Nor can I.
To me, it was always the stories of the people. And I guess that was what my goal was I wanted people to get to know. I think at one point I mentioned these are friends from long ago and family from long ago, and I really wanted to try to, through the book make that personal connection.
Sure. Yeah, that personal connection, it's there throughout. And even when the men that you wrote about are describing some of the things they encountered, I took a quote out of the book where you're quoting, and how is his name pronounced?
I don't know.
Sivert?
I wish I could tell you.
Severed?
Severed. I'm not exactly sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
You have this incredible quote from him where he's describing encountering a landmine.
Yeah.
And he says, "The hell-devised torpedo or infernal machines."
Yeah.
That's how he describes them.
What an interesting description for a landmine.
For a landmine.
I had to look it up.
Yeah.
I'm like, what the heck is an infernal machine?
Yeah.
You know? And I thought, I never realized up till reading his letter that landmines were as prevalent as they were during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's referencing the Battle of Yorktown when they come in after the Confederates have evacuated. And the men start being killed and horribly wounded by these infernal machines, these mines that have been laid and have a trigger on them. And, I always thought that was more of a modern thing. Landmines, a horrible conveyor of death, I think was the term I used in the book.
Yep.
And here they are, Civil War. And there's some historians that claim their use during the war has really helped what kind of propelled them as it's sort of an institution in warfare from then on, their use.
Yeah, there were many innovations that, hesitate to use that word, but there were many developments in battlefield technology during the Civil War, and that's one of many. Did that come out at all as you're reading through the letters that were printed in the Lansing Republican? And not only the fact that these men were involved in something that had happened before, a war, but a very different war, and not only because it was a civil war. This nation that hadn't even been around 100 years now finds itself fighting itself to the death. But on top of that, men who had never been, in many cases, more than a few miles from home, now all of a sudden they're on the battlefield. There are, in some cases, tens of thousands of people around them. They've probably never been in a crowd with anywhere near that many people. And you have the sort of all of industrial America, the beginning of it anyway, is on display there in some of the devices that are on the battlefield.
Yeah. There are a couple of things I could talk about there. One of the things that I found really intriguing, which I, had always wondered about, was even something as simple as transportation. How did you get 90,000 men from Michigan out to the battlefields out east and in the Western Theater? And the whole transportation story was really interesting, and I learned a lot about that by reading the letters. The boys would say, well, we took the stage to Detroit. That was a 10-hour stagecoach ride on the Plank Road from Lansing to Detroit. 10 hours to Detroit.
Yep. You get on
depending on how fast
I
drive, I can do it in about an hour and 20 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
And then they had to get on the steamers to Cleveland, and then the rail cars to Pittsburgh and to Harrisburg and out to Baltimore and D.C. And it took days. I mean, what we can drive now in a long day, it took them literally 8, 9, 10 days to get out to D.C. So the transportation part of it was really interesting to me. They talk about the weapons a little bit, and especially the U.S. sharpshooters companies that formed in Lansing. There are 18 companies of the 2 U.S. Burdans sharpshooters, and 4 of them are formed in Michigan, and 2 of them are officered and formed in Lansing by Lansing boys. And they talk about what kind of weapon they're supposed to be getting, the Sharps carbine, and they don't get them. They end up getting Colt revolvers, I think, revolving rifles. But that whole equipment or lack of equipment, and they spend a lot of their letters complaining. They say, not only have we not been paid, they're still not even giving us our uniforms. We haven't been equipped with rifles. We're at the war front, and we don't have weapons to fight with. One of the gentlemen, Jack Whitman, writes a really comical letter back home, and he said, well, we finally received our arms. Jokingly, he says, the boys from Minnesota are using brickbats, and the other boys are using slings, and the other company's been armed with bows and arrows, and saying, this is a disgrace. We're here to fight to protect the Union and to end slavery, and they're not even giving us the weapons we need. And eventually they do, and they see their fair share of combat.
Yeah, really remarkable stuff. the right towards the beginning of the book, and then you make reference to it, obviously, several times throughout the book. We've talked about the flags, but you also reference that there's an effort underway right now. There's the ongoing effort for the preservation or conservation of the flags, but then there's also an effort underway to get a monument for Michigan constructed at a Civil War battlefield. And I did want to make sure we had some time to get to that today.
I appreciate that, David. We'll take any publicity we can get for our efforts. I'm a part of a group called the Michigan Civil War Association, and formed about 10 years ago with the several goals: education, to educate Michiganders and others about kind of some of the unknown stories of the war. And the way we're fulfilling that is by publishing. We have kind of a publishing arm, if you will, of our association, and we've published several books, one on Charles Tripler, who was the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, a Detroiter. Very, very few people know about Tripler and his work during the Civil War, and helping really to establish a lot of the medical practices that are used in warfare now are established by Charles Tripler. And a number of other books too, including the memoirs of his wife, Eunice Tripler. And we're working now on a book on the contribution of Michigan African-American community, including the 102nd United States Colored Troops that formed here in Michigan. So the other part of that is we're also trying to get a monument built at Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American history, September 17th, 1862. Over 2,000 Michiganders fought at Antietam. Most of the states who had men fight there saw to it that monuments were erected honoring their sacrifice. Michigan, for some reason, never did. We put them up at other battlefields, but not at Antietam. So we're in the process of raising the funds to have a monument built, and we have the property already purchased. We bought it from a private landowner, and since then that rest of that farm has been acquired by the Battlefield Trust, and we're in partnership with the MPS to have this monument put up. And honestly, from what we hear, it may be one of the last monuments that's going to be put up at Antietam, so we're super excited about it. And we're on the working on a website right now for that. We're at Facebook. If you type in Michigan Civil War Association, you can find more information about it.
Yeah, it is interesting that Michigan does not have a monument there.
Yeah, it's sad, really. Our involvement there was incredible, and this is the battle that gave Lincoln the strength he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
Absolutely.
So the role that Michiganders played there was essential. General Israel Richardson was mortally wounded near the Sunken Road, leading his men against the attack against the Sunken Road. There were many other Michigan generals that were there at Antietam, and as I mentioned, a lot of Michigan boys, including boys from Lansing, who were killed at Antietam. Again, I don't like to give the book away, but Jack Whitman was mortally wounded, fighting, leading his men of the sharpshooters at Antietam.
All Civil War battlefields are really moving places to visit for a variety of reasons. Antietam it has a different feel to it, and I think part of the reason for that is because not only knowing the magnitude of what happened there, but you could say that about any Civil War battlefield. But I think part of it is because of the fact that that whole area, that corner of, I guess it would be northwestern Maryland, there's been considerable effort that has been made to have not just the actual places that people walked on that day in September of 1862, but the whole area preserved to an extent. It's really remarkable.
They've really done an excellent job. In my opinion, Antietam was one of the more pristine battlefields in the MPS system because it was secluded enough where it wasn't as highly developed as some of the other battlefields were. And I tell you a real quick story. I took my son there a number of years ago. We were actually going out to deliver a battle flag from our collection. Our conservator's laboratory is about 15 minutes from the Antietam battlefield in West Virginia. So we took the flag out to West Virginia, and my son and I went out to the battlefield. And I think it was the first time my son had been on a battlefield. You know, he's in his late 20s now, but he was 11 at the time. And I remember we were there on a President's Day weekend, the President's Day, the Monday of that weekend. maybe it was a Saturday. We had the battlefield to ourselves. I mean,
Sure,
it was
'cause that time of year.
February. We walked in the sunken road, and I was trying to explain to my son Nicholas about the battle and the horrific things that had happened there. They said by the end of that battle, if one was of a mind to, you could walk the whole length of the sunken road and not have your foot touch the ground because it was so filled with with bodies. Yeah. And I was explaining it to Nick, and he looked up at me and he said, "Dad, I can almost hear their screams." And I thought, oh, I did it. A dad historian, I made an impact on this kid.
That's incredible.
And he got it, you know. But Antietam has that feel. I mean, they're farm grounds, active farm grounds.
Active farm grounds.
It's just, I think you smell the smells that the boys smelled that day, and you hear some of the noises they heard, and you see the sights that they saw. And it's hard not to be immersed in that.
You're literally connected to it. And the generations are all present at one moment. The moment for me came when I was there, when I walked over the bridge, Burnside Bridge, and then the tiny little plaque there that casually mentions that John F. Kennedy drove his car over there.
Yeah.
The presidential motorcade on the 100th anniversary of the battlefield.
Yeah, isn't that something?
And
just a few months. Well,
it's really remarkable. And of course, you know, he wasn't president for much longer after that because of the horrible assassination. And then there's also the reality that even until the 1960s, you had this
one of the drive your car over that bridge if you were president or not.
In
you
the
could
United
still
States,
drive your car over Burnside's bridge.
Little county road through rural Maryland, and we'll hop on the bridge and get over Antietam Creek.
And that's something.
It really is.
Yeah.
So, well, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's been my honor. I so appreciate the invitation, and anytime I can talk about Michigan and the war and our incredible effort, it's a good day.
Absolutely. And the book is called Lansing and the Civil War.
It is.
And author is Matt VanAcker, and thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you, David.
Betcha. And we will see all of you again next time on Lanstories.
You've been listening to Lanstories with me, David Siwik. For more information on this program and to stream past episodes, visit lccconnect.org. LCC Connect is the official home of the voices, vibes, and vision of Lansing Community College, offering hours of original and exciting programming. Hosted by faculty, staff, and community members, LCC Connect explores our college's work in the community, important topics in higher education, and our vision for the future. Catch the vibe on 89.7 FM or online at lccconnect.org. Until next time, remember, keep telling good stories.